you've got to consciously choose what you're going to do to make money that suits your personality.
Right, yeah.
If being out in nature is who you are, then don't take a job in a building somewhere, or it will be a shitty job and your motivation will go down, you won't do well, and if you're not inspired to do well, you won't be inspired to learn, and you won't learn how to learn, and you won't learn to have the confidence and the inspiration to tackle problems and add something to the world. You will just be on the hind tit mama's boy trying to get by like people living off of credit cards or taking workman's compensation and faking that they're injured and all sorts of horse shit that goes on rampantly around the world.
Paul Chek is no stranger to the fitness and wellness industry. In fact, Paul Chek is internationally renowned in fields of corrective and high performance exercise, kinesiology, and his approach to treatment and education has changed the lives of countless people worldwide. Founder of the C.H.E.K Institute, Paul has changed fitness industry with his revolutionary programs, courses and DVDs. Thousands of people worldwide have been trained in one or more of these challenging and elite level certification programs. So we're up here in a magnificent place with Paul Chek on the Escape Your Limits podcast.
Thank you.
So thanks very much, Paul, for taking the time and allowing us to come up into your home.
My pleasure.
So, I guess I've never seen anyone with such a wide collection of teas either.
Yeah, I have a wide collection of teas and herbs and flower essences and mineral essences and essential oils. I'm kind of an alchemist.
Yeah, I saw that by looking in your cabinet. Yeah. But just that, I guess from where you are, you've built up an amazing collection of achievements and skills. But what was the young Paul Chek like? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up. My father died. He drowned when I was 8, but he took off. He was a competitive dancer and a professional drag racer. And by the time my mom was 18, she had 3 kids, and my dad just took off and left her. So my mother worked 2 waitressing jobs back to back every day to pay the babysitter to keep an eye on us. And then she met my stepfather, who was a special effects man for Universal Studios, but he also had a degree in agriculture. And they wanted to get us out of the Los Angeles area, and they wanted to move to Vancouver Island, British Columbia, where my father still is.
Right.
So we moved there in 72. We had a 140-acre sheep farm, and my dad bought a carding mill, which is a mill for processing the wool after we shear the sheep, and then it can be sold for crafts work. So our big function of the farm, the primary function, was producing natural wool, and my dad specialized in crossbreeding sheep to get black offspring, and so that the wool's naturally black, not dyed, which is a rare, more expensive form of the wool because it adds color.
Right.
So my parents' business, and my mother's a spinner and a weaver and a craftswoman and a sculptor, as you can see. And so the family business was producing wool and selling it to the local craftspeople, but much of it went to the Indians who made sweaters and gloves and booties and things for the tourist industry on Vancouver Island. And we also raised pigs, chickens, horses. We had our own milking cows. We were pretty much fully self-contained. We rarely had to get much from the store. Our own meat. My dad we slaughtered and butchered our own meat. And so we also had a large garden and sold produce, and we also sold firewood. So I spent a lot of my life cutting trees down, bucking them into sections, splitting them into cords of firewood and stacking them, which is a lot of work. And my mother's a yogi. She's been a yogi since I was 12. She's been to India and done 3 advanced initiations through Self-Realization Fellowship, which is Paramahansa Yogananda's teachings. As I was sharing earlier, I not only was raised from the age of 12 in the temple of the Self-Realization Fellowship philosophy, but also when I was 15, I went away and spent the summer with monks and learned a variety of meditation techniques, self-management techniques, and the philosophy of yoga as taught by Yogananda, which became sort of the foundation of my developmental life. But
that was at 15, was it?
Yes.
Wow.
And so the upbringing that I had was very, very close to the earth, living on a farm, a working farm. My mother being very holistic, and my father. We pretty much raised everything we ate, and anything else came from a co-op that sold organic food. And I learned early that I had more energy than most athletes, even the guys that were training at the same level as me. And it didn't take me long to figure out a lot of it was the way they were eating that was causing them problems.
Right. What kind of training was you doing back then?
I did a lot. I was involved in martial arts and kickboxing, and I fought competitively as a boxer.
Was this at school?
I started boxing when I was 12. By the time I was 17, I was heavy into martial arts. I raced motocross when I was young. I was sponsored by a Honda shop, and they paid for all my repairs and got me to the races and took care of that for me. But I won my first licensed motocross event right out of the box. I won the whole thing. Because my father put me in the rodeo when I was young, so the transition to a motorcycle was quite natural for me, and at least you can control the motorcycle. You can't control a bull or a horse, that's not broken. And it was a great way for me to release my emotion. My father was not an easy man to live with. He was very, very demanding and could be extremely physically abusive. So you had to live on the edge of your seat all the time. So a lot of that emotion I had to get out of me. And I found the best way for me to do that actually was boxing and kickboxing. And racing motorcycles allowed me to be at such a high level of intensity. It brought me into a meditative focus because, I was going fast enough that if I wasn't paying attention, I might be dead. And I did have 6 very bad concussions in my motocross racing career. One time I was out for 2 days and had no idea who or what or where I was. But when I joined the Army because I just felt like I needed to find a way to get some advanced job training, and I didn't enjoy school at all. I left the school. My last year of school was the 9th grade, and I was in the 10th grade, but three months in, my then girlfriend got pregnant.
Right.
And I just had no desire to be in school, and neither of our families had enough money to support a whole other family. So I just made the executive decision to go get a job, and I started my work career at 16, if I remember right, maybe 17. No, she became pregnant when I was just turned 18. Or no, my son was born when I just turned 18.
Right.
So I had left school before she got pregnant, but just because I didn't fit in there.
No.
And so I was taking care of myself. I left home at 16, was making great money, worked my way up to the top of the logging camp industry, worked in the drilling industry, was an apprentice bricklayer, was an apprentice heavy mechanic. I mean, I did a lot of things. I went to journeyman school through the Canadian government and became licensed as an automotive industrial repair technician and learned, everything about engines, hydraulics, vulcanizing tires, everything you need to know to work in the automotive industry. But I couldn't make enough money, so logging gave me quite a good income. And then I got into stock car racing, and fortunately I was making enough money logging and working on drilling rigs to fund my stock car racing exploits, which I really loved, actually. But I reached this point where I felt like if I wanted to really make good money, I needed to get into a more technical field. And the unemployment rate was so high in Vancouver Island at that time, I had to leave to keep feeding the family. And I found a buddy of mine had moved to Florida and was working on fishing boats there. So he said, why don't you come down here? There's lots of work. And being an American, it was no problem. I flew down there and I got a job in 1 hour. And so I brought my whole family to Florida, but I found the fishing industry to be quite cutthroat, and they play a lot of games with the workers. And after one fishing season, I averaged it out. I was only making $2.35 an hour.
So was that your main driver at that time, just sort of making money for survival for your family?
Well, it was making money, but is really, my athletic career in all areas was my way of expressing myself. And when I joined the Army, I had a backup plan. I purposefully chose to be a paratrooper because, one, I wanted to be with the badasses. Two, the 82nd Airborne Division is home to the Army boxing team, and it's and the Army boxing team, that I've been watching them on Wide World of Sports as a kid for years, and they're, Army boxing team. When I was on the Army boxing team, we were the third ranked amateur boxing team in the world. We'd only been beaten by Cuba and Russia. And you can only get on the team by fighting your way on. You got to beat somebody on the team, which is not an easy trick to do. So I actually was working down in Florida for a guy that owned a marina. I was doing marine mechanics, repairing the engines of a marine craft. And he was an ex-fighter pilot in the Navy. And he said, Paul, the best thing to do if you want to get some good training is see which military service will take you. The only one that would take me without a high school diploma was the Army. So I went and did all the entrance examinations, and they said to me, you scored high enough to be a pilot. If you will just go to school and get a 2-year associate's degree, you can come back, we'll train you as a Cobra helicopter or a Bell or a UH-1 pilot, but you qualify. And I maxed the scores on electrical, mechanical, and related testing. And I said, I have zero desire to go to school. What's the best job you can give me? What's the job that will give me the most pay when I get out of the military? Well, it turned out to be repairing weapon systems on Cobra helicopters. And the guys leaving the Army at that time, which was 83 when I went in, were starting off at $89,000 a year working for Bell Helicopter, which today would be about $160,000 a year. So that was my plan.
Right.
And I spent the first year in electronics school, and then I had to go to jump school to be a paratrooper. But when I got into my unit, it was boring as hell because they don't let you do anything beyond rank. So as a private, all you can do is take the access panels off. And I thought, this is horseshit. I just scored tied for the top 3 after a year of training. Me and 3 guys were 0.3 of 1 point apart for the highest grades. I averaged 97% after 26 tests in a year of electronics training. I used to build my own race car engines from the ground up, build my own frames. I was a welder as a young man and could weld high pressure pipe and everything, and now I'm reduced to a Phillips screwdriver technician. I'm like, this sucks. And I started gaining weight, which I didn't like because I was in a 0-1 priority unit, which means we're the first ones to go to war anywhere in the world. So if any helicopter breaks down, you have to work on it nonstop till it's fixed because you have to be ready to go to war anywhere, anytime. So we'd often do these 36-hour stints, and that's how I first got addicted to caffeine, by the way. I'm like, what the hell, this sucks. Because it's too technical to explain the details, but if you fall asleep on the job because you're controlling the weapon systems, you can blow the hangar up or ruin the helicopter. Right. So I realized that I had to put plan B into place, which was to fight my way onto the Army boxing team and spend the rest of my career as an athlete. And it was very hard because there was no breaks. It was hard to train. We were working long hours. I was exhausted. I was addicted to caffeine. I had gained 8 pounds, and I looked and felt the worst I'd ever in my life. So I just started doing push-ups and sit-ups and hanging from pipes in the aircraft hangar and doing chin-ups and going for runs early in the morning because the military runs, they were too slow for me. I also represented the Army in triathlon, by the way, which I was. So what happened is I got myself in shape, went down, scheduled a tryout, knocked out one of the guys, took his spot.
Oh, right.
But after a few months, I was also representing the Army in triathlon. I won the Army triathlon. My wife won the women's division, which is the first time a husband and wife had ever won an Army triathlon together. And then my company commander wanted me to train and represent the Army in the national championships because I qualified for the national championships in Hilton Head, South Carolina that year. So he said, if you don't want to work with the boxers anymore, I'll let you just train full-time for triathlon. So I said, it's great because it's a lot of work. And I was originally fighting on the team, but when I went back and told them I was going to leave, they said, oh, don't do that. We'll make you the trainer and put you in charge of nutrition, writing all their training programs, managing the gym. And I offered to do massage therapy because I really felt massage therapy would help the fighters. And I'd been studying books on sports massage therapy, and my wife had been working on me with no training other than what we could just pick up out of books, and it was making a world of difference in my training.
And how did it, when you got offered that position to train the trainers then, was that because you'd already had some qualifications in being a diet and...
No, the qualification was they couldn't figure out how the hell I could fight so hard in the third round. And they had a big problem with guys burning out in the third round.
Right.
And they were also baffled that I was training usually about 250 to 300 miles a week on my bicycle. I was running about 40 miles a week, and I was swimming an average of a mile a day on top of 6 to 8 hours a day of boxing training.
Right.
And they always noticed that I ate what they called weird. I ate raw vegetables dipped in yogurt sauces. I ate lean meats. I basically ate the way I did on the farm,
right,
but I kept it to only the amount that I could eat without gaining weight, which wasn't much because my natural walking around weight is about 164 pounds, and I fought at 147, and even at 164, I only got about 8% body fat on me. So I had to be very calculated so I didn't weaken myself,
right,
and end up a weakling in a boxing ring that was starving to death. And the other guys had no discipline in general, so they would crash diet, take these things called piss pills to force them to urinate, and be standing there screaming their head off in the toilet because they would have so much pain because it was dehydrating them so bad, dressing up in full length body suits and skipping rope in saunas for hours at a time to make weight. So by the time they got there, they were just completely and utterly fried and dehydrated, but I never did that. So they said, whatever you're doing, and also they were deadly afraid of weightlifting because so many athletes had been ruined because they were mixing bodybuilding with boxing, and they didn't understand the science of weightlifting. But I grew up with one of my best buddies was the world champion in kickboxing. He was my sparring partner for 3 years in boxing, and he was the Canadian lightweight champion. Another one of my buddies was Mr. Canada in bodybuilding and owned the biggest gym in town. Two of my other buddies were nationally ranked motocross racers that I used to race with, and 5 or 6 of my buddies were elite skiers. Probably 6 of my buddies had black belts in various martial arts. And so I came from this melting pot of badass athletes, and so I had studied everything I could get my hands on with regard to how to beat these guys, because they were not easy customers to hang out with, not in a boxing gym, not on skis, not anywhere. And so by the time I got to the Army, I had already grounded myself in natural principles and saw that they worked. For example, when I was a paratrooper, we had, it's endless athletic competitions. I never, ever let a Navy SEAL beat me at anything, and that was one of my claims to fame. Paul's one of the few guys that can outdo the Navy SEALs and the Marine Recon Rangers. And so when they saw the way that I trained and the way I managed myself, and that I didn't have to do any stupid stuff to make weight, and that I strategically lost weight, sometimes for 3 months progressively, on a very careful, steady plan, they already knew I know more about nutrition and training than they did, and they saw that I was lifting weights all the time, and they knew for sure it didn't slow me down because I knocked one of their best fighters out to get on the team, and I'd knocked plenty others out in front of them. And so they just basically turned it over to me, and it was quite fortunate because the team physician was an osteopathic physician. He wasn't a traditional MD. Being an osteopath, he was more grounded in kind of some natural approaches and more integrated into concepts that we would think of as chiropractic but osteopathic. And so I was able to work with him for 2 years while I was the trainer before I left the team. My first year in the military was all electronics training and parachute training and basic training. But I got to learn to take care of acute sports injuries, and the Army boxing gym was the headquarters for many Army sports, whether it be track and field, powerlifting, lots of them. So I was in contact with the baddest athletes in the 82nd Airborne Division, and there's 80,000 soldiers on post at that time. And paratroopers are, there's an old saying, the paratroopers were the 1,000 legs, meaning non-paratroopers, but the paratroopers are definitely a different breed of creature, right? You got to be crazy to jump into enemy territory behind enemy lines at night, usually from very low altitudes, under extreme pressure, including fire.
Yeah.
So it takes a certain personality, and it's usually from the paratroopers that they get their black berets, the rangers, and their green berets, and Delta Force. So I basically took over that and learned with the osteopathic physician how to take care of all these acute sports injuries that were happening, whether it be muscle tears, dislocations, the things that happen to athletes on a routine basis. When you got that many of them, there's a lot of injuries happening. And so I made quite a study of that, and he was very open-minded, and I actually would propose philosophies to him from my own studies about various things that I kept seeing happening. And he was open-minded and actually agreed with me at times, which gave me a lot of confidence that I was moving in the right direction with my studies and my concepts. So when it came time to get out of the Army, I had no desire to be in the Army once I realized what Uncle Sam was up to, and that we were really just the weapon of rich people to steal shit, which irritated the hell out of me. So I realized the best thing I could do was to study sports massage therapy, because I could do that without a college degree. And
what was your thing about, God, you mentioned school, like you're obviously a massive learner. But
yeah.
Why did you mention sort of getting out of school and not wanting to go to school? Did you just have an issue with how school was being taught?
Well, being raised on a farm and my father, like I said, was a no bullshit kind of guy. So, his philosophy was like, say the baler broke down. He would say something like, I'll be back in 2 hours. You better get the baler fixed. I don't give a fuck how you do it. And what he meant is if I come back and it's not fixed, I'll beat the shit out of you. So I learned right away, beg, borrow, steal, use the phone, hike over the mountains, get to the neighbor's house, do whatever the hell you got to do to get the job done. And so I became very, very pragmatic, because I didn't have room for farting around. So I had to ask the right questions to the right people and get things done. So when you live in an environment like that and you go to school and you find yourself studying, the history of rubber trees in India, and you're like, how the fuck does this apply to my life? I mean, I was already thinking ahead, like, what is all this social studies and English literature and have anything to do with how I'm going to make a living and fund my hobbies and feed a potential family? And then when I didn't see the two connecting, and also I wasn't impressed with almost none of my teachers. They would just look like burnt out of shape, unhealthy, unhappy people that were doing what they had to do to make a living. And I repeatedly got in big trouble for asking questions that they couldn't answer, and they didn't like my questions. As I told you in our meeting earlier, the same thing happened to me in Sunday school when my mother was a Christian. When she became a yogi, it was completely different. But I didn't feel that there was much in school that really lended me support for what I thought the real world was going to require of me, and I had a real good taste of that being on my dad's farm. And we're a farm that has to make money or we starve to death. So it's kind of like being on a farm business.
Right.
So I already had this sense of what has to happen and what happens when it doesn't, right? You mess with the animals and they don't get taken care of. You got nothing to eat. You don't take care of your crops. You got nothing. So you have to dial in to what really works. You can't play stupid games. And I found school was largely just a bunch of people learning old, outdated shit that wasn't really practical. And I couldn't see any evidence of it. In fact, looking back, most of the guys I grew up with, when I left the Army, they tried to get me to stay in the Army. They offered to promote me. And I said, look, I will be making more than a general makes 3 years from now. And that was my promise to myself. And exactly 3 years after the day I left the Army, I made $101,000. At that time, a one-star general was making $90,000 US. So, and since then, Penny and I have probably sold $40+ million worth of education through the C.H.E.K Institute. So basically what I'm telling you in a nutshell is I did not see much evidence, and then the guys that I knew with advanced degrees usually couldn't find their fucking ass if it was sitting on their nose. I didn't see any real evidence that all this academic achievement really helped people. The
Right.
people that impressed me the most were people like brick masons and builders and mechanics and people that had practical knowledge and could use their hands to produce something tangible to make your life work better.
Right.
You know, and I didn't see a lot of that around me. I saw just a lot of fancy words and a lot of unhealthy bodies and screwed up lives, and it was the same with religion. I saw that it was a very, very big rat trap for most people's minds, and that they were getting caught and confused in a lot of silliness that later investigations demonstrated to me that it was really just brainwashing. And I'm not against religion, as I said to you, but I'm against the abuse of religion. So there's, you know, we have corporate education. You know, what I saw is that people in general in educational institutions are taught what to think, but they are not taught how to think.
Right.
And my father and the people that I worked for as a young man taught me how to think.
Right.
Because if you don't know how to think, especially where I come from on Vancouver Island, where, you know, you can be buried in snow and next minute swimming in rain and mud, and you still got to get the job done. Things have to go on. Life goes on. So it's a much harder environment. And
give me an example of that. Then I think I get what you're saying, but in terms of, you know, at school they teach you what to think, and in your farm it's how. So give me an example of what you learned about how to think.
Well, what I learned about how to think is, one, you always have to study both sides of a problem to really understand it. Okay, so let's say that an animal gets a disease. If you only study the disease, but you don't really know what makes health, then you can end up giving the animal a bunch of drugs and think, okay, the animal will be fine. But if you don't realize, for example, that hoof rot comes from too much moisture accumulating in fields, then you keep giving the animals antibiotics, which ultimately wipes their body out, kills the mitochondria, turns them into sick animals, but you haven't irrigated the fields to stop the hoof rot.
Right.
So what I learned is step number one is you've always got to study both sides of a problem. But most people in academia are highly polarized, and they believe their way is the only way, and they don't even want to look at the other side of a problem because it's almost sacrilegious, kind of like a Christian won't study Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Taoism because they kind of program you to think those are all the works of the devil. Well, when you start studying some of these other religions, you realize Christianity's really, and Judaism and Islam are really religions for children, because they teach you that God is taking care of you. God's doing everything for you, and all you got to do is worship this invisible daddy in the sky. And paradoxically, you'll get your reward in the afterlife. But in the meantime, you get tortured and bled out instead of actually thinking, wait a minute, look, let's apply constructive thinking here. Right? It doesn't make sense. Why would you torture yourself to get favor from an invisible God that paradoxically is very different than the gods in other religions? So there's no unifying theme whatsoever there. So I gave you a farming example, I gave you a religion example, and an academic example. Well, there's a million of them. I mean, all you got to do is look at any field. For example, if you look at nutrition, well, hell, academic nutrition, all you got to do is go to a nutrition conference and it looks like an obesity conference and it's all nutritionists. The entire field of nutrition was actually started by General Mills in the late 30s and early 40s to train people to sell processed food, and they called them nutritionists. But it's actually purported to be a healthcare industry, but it's not. So what do you have? You got billions of people all over the world buying pills that are packaged, that come from corporately farmed, commercially farmed soils, and there is no way to filter pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides out of those plants, and the chemicals in the soil wipe out the microorganism populations, which means you don't have any nutrient resources or energetic resources available to the plant because the plants themselves are malnourished and sick. So now we give this to people all over the world calling it nutrition, but really what they're eating is concentrated doses of low nutrient value plants that are highly sick and highly toxic. So the same way, for example, a killer whale eats several hundred pounds of salmon a day. So if the killer whale's eating salmon that are poisoned by mercury and it's eating several hundred pounds a day, eating killer whale would be very, very toxic, just like eating tuna is toxic because it eats piles of smaller fish, all of which have mercury poisoning.
Right.
So
how does the everyday person, like, you operate in a world of, I guess, professionals that, probably the elite, the few people, but the mass public have a very, I guess, diluted view, and there's, everything that you can read in one magazine or one podcast or blog post is totally contradicted by another one, and they seem both credible sources.
That's perfect. My students come to me with that paradox all the time, and that's what led me to do all the research that I did to develop the systems that I did.
Right.
Because the deeper you go into any field, the more you realize equally qualified experts sit on both sides of the debate table, and nobody can agree on almost any damn thing. And I tell my students that's exactly what you need. And they say, why? It's so confusing. I say, so you'll use your own damn brain and go research it and test it on yourself first. My philosophy is make yourself the guinea pig first. Everything I've taught anyone I've tested extensively on myself or in my clinical practice, and then refined it to where I was confident enough that I wasn't misleading people to teach it to them.
Right.
The fact that we have juxtaposition or checkmate in almost any field on any topic is an invitation to stop listening to other people who think they're experts, most of which don't even practice what they preach. I can show you loads of experts on biomechanics and weightlifting that can't lift weights. There's mountains of them out there, for example. Experts on nutrition that don't understand. For example, you cannot be an expert on nutrition if you don't understand basic soil science, because basic soil science is what produces the damn nutrition in the plant in the first place. But I don't think I can count the nutritionists on one hand that I've met in my life traveling the world lecturing to these people that even had a clue how microorganisms works, how the soil is structured, how it captures cosmic radiation, how that energizes soil, what the difference is between paramagnetic and diamagnetic soil or stones, and how they work together to create a magnetic attraction. And the list just fucking goes on, right? So
So just coming back to that point then, like contradiction, you do it yourself, and you mentioned in terms of what you got taught on the farm, which is how to think, not what to think.
Right.
Is that a philosophy then that carry through to your own teachings? Because that's, I guess, a big part of your business is
yes.
education.
Ultimately, what a Chek professional is someone who's taught a system of how to gather the essential data you need to make an intelligent decision about a physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual problem. Spiritual means encapsulated. It means your connection to the larger whole,
right?
Which at first is the world, then it is the solar system, then it's the galaxy, then it's the cosmos, and then it's what's behind all that. Some people call it God. The Buddhists call it the ground of being. The Taoists would maybe refer to it as the Tao, or Wu Qi, not life, is the source of life itself. So behind Tai Chi is Wu Qi.
Right.
Tai Chi means life force or love.
So going a bit deeper than normal, what you're saying, absolutely makes sense. But you've got, you're obviously quite a rebellious character, and you don't give a shit what people say in a lot of cases. You get, I guess, sort of new people coming in the industry where they're learning themselves, and if they go out a little bit on a limb, it's like, well, okay, I've learned this stuff and I actually believe in it. How do younger people that are going into or coming into this sort of wellness space, as we'll call it, how do they buck the trend and face being ridiculed about an idea that may be right, but you've got people saying, well, you've gone on one of those weird courses and that's all, it's a cult, it's blah, blah, blah. How would someone deal with that?
Well, that's part of the hero's journey.
Right.
There's no way you can avoid that. It's inherently woven into human culture. And I believe it's an essential quality that guarantees that we grow spiritually, which in Jungian terms means to become individuated, to truly be centered in yourself And you can't truly be centered in yourself as long as you need other people's approval to feel good about yourself or to trust yourself. If you need other people's approval to feel good about yourself or trust yourself, you're still a child. You're still codependent on others for your identity. You're not truly a man until you mean what you say and you say what you mean. And you can't mean what you say and say what you mean until you've done enough life and enough of your own exploring to identify what it is that you really mean, so that when you say it, you mean it. Because if you say it without having life experience to back it up, you don't really know what you're saying anyhow. You're just a child using fancy words, like a 6-year-old telling your mother how to drive a car because you play video games. So there's a couple of points there in our process of spiritual growth and development. First, we're a child. Then I've broken into 4 phases: the child, the warrior, the king or queen, and then the wise man or woman. When you're a child, you're codependent on everybody else for your identity. If your parents are Christians, you go, and eventually you become a teenager, you go through puberty, you start rebelling because it's a natural process, or evolution would halt. If we all were copies of our mom and dad, evolution would cease to exist. So our hormonal system builds a rebel into us. And then we have the opportunity to either succumb to society and culture and just emulate the same silliness, or we go on the hero's journey and we go out and we spend enough time in the culture to recognize the limitations, where things are not efficient, what can be done better. You get people like Martin Luther King, all the great minds that said, hey, wait a minute, we're not doing what we should be doing to be truly human, or we're not doing it as efficiently as we could in a manufacturing process or whatever. And typically our education systems were designed to stifle creativity, because when plantation owners were doing mass productions, whether it be planting or early manufacturing, they didn't want people changing the process, because it usually led to a disruption in assembly lines or production. And so slaves were kept quite dumb because they didn't want them getting involved in the creative process, because it usually ended up costing them money, and they all thought they were smarter than everybody else, and even the slaves. So our education system is really a corporate education system designed to teach people what to do and not how to think, so they will do exactly what they're told to do, which leads to people becoming adults but still having not explored for themselves, and still needing their boss's approval, their parents' approval, having to fit into a church even though they sit in church reading magazines and not really paying attention, and they're afraid if they get criticized because they're not interested or they change their philosophy that nobody will love them anymore. That's the hallmark of a child. At some point, though, you have to become a warrior and figure out, what is it that I represent? What is meaningful to me? I told you I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. I joined right when Grenada was happening because I felt I needed to protect our country. And so it was an important mission for me. Right when I got qualified to go to war, Grenada came to an end, so I became a peacetime paratrooper. But the reality of it is my own investigations led me to the realization that I wasn't working for the United States government or for the people. I was working for a bunch of rich people that used the government as a sort of a joke to distract people from what was really going on. And I did not want to be involved in using high-powered destructive weapons to steal oil and take other people's land, and corporate manipulation and all the kind of horse shit that the military is used for. And most guys in the military are still so programmed they're not even willing to look at what's going on. In fact, I've had conversations with Navy SEALs about this, and they don't like it because at the bottom line, they want to kill people because that's exciting to them, and they don't want to question it, because if they do, then they got nobody to go hunt. So, not all of them are like that. Most of them are just elite hunters that find it more interesting to hunt humans than animals. And that's just my experience. I don't mean to be saying that all Navy SEALs are that way or all elite soldiers are that way, but there is really that component, and I'm qualified to say that because I lived, worked, and trained with these guys.
All right. So the big thing there really is about questioning what you're doing, thinking thinking, not just going along with everything that's sort of out there.
What can I do to improve the process? But first, is the process something that we really want to support?
Yeah.
Right? Like right now, the military should be put full force to work to rehabilitate the soils, clean the waters, and get heavy metals and things out of the air, such as aluminum, all the crazy shit they're doing to try to control weather patterns. I mean, we should turn the military into an earth healing force, an earth saving force, reforestation. I mean, we are right on the edge of total destruction. Everybody's so busy playing with fucking cell phones and doing silly shit and watching mindless television, they don't realize critical things. Rudolf Steiner said all the way back in the late 1800s, there's two things life depends on, and if they reach a critically low level, life will cease to exist as we know it and will not support humanity. One is the trees. We've wiped them almost all out. We're killing the rainforest at some massive amount every day. And the other one's the bees. And we have more problems with bees dying now than ever in the history of recorded time. And it's being tracked back to pesticides and electromagnetic pollution. And it's wiping them out. And recent research just came out of Europe not too long, a couple of months ago, where they got the scare of their lives because entomologists all over the world started noticing that bug traffic was way down. So they started doing experiments to quantify how bad it was. And when they got the results in, the paper was called something like Armageddon May Be Here. And they found that through multiple scientists around the world monitoring bug traffic, in the last 50 years, bug traffic has gone down 75% in only 15 years. Well, that surely has to correlate to the use of chemicals and electromagnetic stress. I won't go into the science of electromagnetic stress and how it would affect bugs, but I've studied it extensively. And so here we are, the sex organs of the planet, we have a 75% reduction in bug traffic. Well, just let me ask you this. Well, what happened if you had a 75% reduction in sperm production? Well, you wouldn't have many kids.
No.
You know, that's just a fact, right? So here we are with someone like Donald Trump who says keep drilling and fracking and has the greenhouse effect isn't real and all this asinine corporate bullshit. Yet those of us that actually study how the world works know we're heading for a very, very big problem right now while we're so busy eating junk food, watching television, and being pacified, being told what to think, not learning how to think.
Right.
So the answer to your question, which I have not forgotten, is simply that first you have to be in the matrix, the family, the church, the school, to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And anybody that's paying attention soon realizes there are limitations in the system. There's shortcomings, and there's also systems that are designed not to allow you to grow outside of the system because they don't want the system challenged. Science is one system like that. So once you realize there's ways you can enhance the system with your own creativity, your own intelligence, and your unique genius. No two of us sees the world the same way. Right. You and me both eat the same chocolate bar. We think we're both eating chocolate, but if we could actually record it with very elaborate scientific equipment, our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, it would be very, very different experience for both of us.
Right.
Right? That's just a fact. So I'm saying each person has a unique perspective on life and every functional aspect of what's happening. They look like they're human, but their experience is unique, and we all have a unique soul with unique experiences and unique, shall we say, awarenesses. And so each of us is invited to step up to the plate and share our observations and share what we've been able to produce or what we propose to produce to make life better in some way. Now, that can be better being a better soldier, or it can be being a better school teacher, or it can be being a better farmer or a welder or a craftsman or whatever it is.
So let's just jump on that point there then. So you when you left school and you had a reason, you needed to earn money, you had a family, and you had from what you said, you had a bit of a process that you went through to get better jobs, and you left the army, and there was a kind of a financial element to it.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think for, again, sort of younger people where they're not sure of what that unique skill is that they have? They know they're interested in this space. Yeah. But they don't really know what they've got to contribute, or whether they really have got anything different. What thoughts and advice based on your experience would you give people where it's like, well, what is my skill? You know,
Well,
am I here to
part
offer?
of the warrior stage, which is I've left home, I'm on my own now, which in our culture often doesn't happen until people are 30. I've met people 35 years old still living with mommy and daddy. I took off at 16 because I had enough of the parental control to last me a lifetime. I said, if I'm going to work this hard, I'm going to work on my own damn farm for me. So my point is that's part of the hero's journey, because you have to get enough experience with enough ways of, shall we say, earning a living or exploring to trigger your soul's awareness of what it is that really fills your heart.
Right.
So the first stage is getting out into the world, and you can't really have a lifetime dream because you don't know enough about yourself or the world yet. But you got to start standing up for yourself and standing up for something. And oftentimes as you grow, the things that you stood up for, like I once stood up for the United States because I thought we had a legitimate threat. But when I realized that that was really part of a bigger chess game going on, then I realized I couldn't invest in standing up for that. I had to use the opportunity for something else. So I used it to get myself educated, got onto the Army boxing team, which led me to becoming the trainer of the Army boxing team, which led me to studying lots of things, which gave me the clarity. And all of a sudden I realized, as I'm working with athletes and being a therapist, that my knowledge of mechanics, my knowledge of hydraulic systems, my knowledge of electronics, my knowledge of farming systems, my knowledge of anatomy, all of it all of a sudden converged.
Right.
And what happened was I had people saying to me, Paul, you know, you're the first person I've ever seen that can explain what a herniated disc is so I can understand it. You're the first person that actually can explain the nervous system to me in a way that I understand it. Because if I was talking to a welder, I spoke in terms that a welder understands. If I was talking to a plumber, I used plumbing concepts to say this is how you're plumbed inside, right? And so what I'm pointing out here is that the first thing we got to do as a young person is make a living for ourselves, or we're still on the hind titty, we're still a child. And so sometimes you have to kind of prostitute yourself to whatever the best opportunity you can get is. But what you find later on is every one of them, it's almost as though there's a magic guide, gives you some piece of awareness that ultimately becomes meaningful when you get to the point where you realize what your gift to the world is going to be.
Right.
So we go through that stage of identifying what really fills us. I found that I was full of love when I was helping athletes achieve their dreams, when I was helping athletes win state championships, national championships, Olympics, world titles, and they would come back and say, oh my God, Paul, eating the way you taught me to and the therapy you're doing on me, I feel better than ever. And then I felt I had purpose.
Right.
That gave me a labor of love. I now found a labor that was supported by my heart. And you will find that if you don't find the labor that activates the heart, that you only have the labor. And most of us cannot handle a world of nothing but labor, which is one of the reasons there's so much anxiety and depression. People literally are afraid. Anxiety means I'm afraid tomorrow will be like yesterday. Depression means I'm so tired of trying to figure it out and I can't find myself or anything meaningful, or I'm so afraid to become who I'm meant to be that I'm burned out now and I give up.
Right.
So
would you say some of it's like when you're going through this sort of first phase, it is a case of, look, just not being too concerned, just try stuff and just feel it out.
Well, I was always concerned. I was concerned about which of the available jobs would pay me the most money, was what I was going to do something that I felt I could do for 8 or 10 hours a day without going crazy.
Yeah.
I learned early how to get a job done. So for me, I never had a hard time getting a job. I just improvised and adapted, but I also knew I wasn't going to go look for a job as a waiter because that's just not who I am. I'd go crazy in there. I'd be carrying 100 plates at once and trying to juggle them to entertain myself. But, so I looked for jobs that challenged me. Working in the logging industry, I worked myself from the bottom to the top of a logging camp in about 2 years. At 18, 19 years of age, I was making $250 a day working a 6-hour day. It takes most men 30 years to do that, 25 to 30 years in a log camp to go from chokerman to faller. Well, too long of a story how I did it, but I set my fucking mind to it. In 1 year, I went from the bottom to the top of the drill crew to where I was running the equipment. I was able to handle the whole machine. I was dowsing successfully. They made me the dowser because I never missed a well. So I found areas where I could grow. I learned a lot about the earth. I learned a lot about nature. I learned a lot about chemistry. I learned a lot about auto mechanics. I learned a lot about machines. I learned a lot about how things work together. I learned a lot about how people have to work together, you know?
So what was that, if you had to sort of describe that, because it sounds like that's what you did in the military, and you did it in the logging, and you did it in, you know, where you are today. What are those things? Just gaining knowledge and being able to apply that as it relates to the job? How would you explain that?
Well, you learn, first of all, you learn how to focus on what's important, which means you have to understand the basic elements of how a system operates. So, you know, whenever you're diagnosing, for example, an electronic system, there's certain things you're looking for. If you're a mechanic, there's 3 things you always have to look for: ignition, compression, and fuel delivery. Or you'll spend truckloads of time, energy, and someone else's money trying to figure out what's wrong, but it could just be a blocked fuel filter. Well, I've seen people get their entire engine taken apart trying to find what was wrong because someone did not know the 3 things you always check for first: ignition, fuel, and compression, right? So when we're working in any trade or environment, the first thing we want to do is identify what are the critical elementary building blocks that everything else is built upon.
Right, okay.
And that's what I did, is I studied
The fundamentals.
Right. So then I could look through the eyes of these different sets of fundamentals, right? So I could go through lots of examples, but I won't take the time. So then what happens is once you get the fundamentals, then you can start building up from there. But what we have today is we have all sorts of people graduating from universities that don't even remember the fundamentals because they got their head stuffed so full of fancy shit that they don't really realize what the fundamentals are. I'll give you a simple example. It won't take you 2 minutes to drive to a physical therapy clinic. You don't even need a compass. Just go in any direction until you find a physical therapy clinic, and you will find people in there, therapists, ultrasounding hypermobile joints without even paying attention to the fact that ultrasound heats ligaments and makes them more lax. I used to watch physical therapists ultrasounding people right after having an anterior cruciate ligament surgery, and I'm saying that person's knee fell apart because it was too lax from a non-contact ACL injury, and you're using heat on the surgeon's repair. That is like bass backwards. That is a very dumb thing to do, but that's what they taught us in school. Look, there's the protocol. And the doctor told me. I'm thinking, well, your doctor doesn't know the basics of how a ligament works. He just knows how to cut them off. I said, let's just get right back to what fascia is, and talked about water, talked about fascia being an electric substance, the properties of fascia, and said, look, you shouldn't be doing that. And I got in fucking truckloads of arguments. And even when I put the evidence right in front of them, they still wouldn't believe it. It's right out of your own textbooks. Okay? That's the program mind. To be on the hero's journey means you got to climb out of the silliness. You got to be brave enough to stand up for what you believe in, but you also have to be wise enough to study the fundamentals so you know you're not deceiving yourself with a bunch of fancy $10 words. So what do we have today? People that read articles think they're an expert, and they sit and argue with me in lectures all over the world and pretend like they know what they're talking about. And I say, look, I put up with it for a few minutes. Then I say, look, if you're going to pull a sword on a samurai, you better know how to use it. And all I do is ask them a question that makes it completely obvious to the audience so they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And that's usually the end of it from them. But the point I'm making is, look, it's like, as a martial artist, you got to know the basics. If you start studying fancy stuff, before you know the basics, somebody without a lot of training will knock the piss out of you in a competition. And you go, I can't understand what happened. When I was a white belt, I was beating up black belts in Taekwondo, and it used to absolutely infuriate our instructor, who was a little Korean 4th degree black belt. But I came to Taekwondo from boxing, and these guys did not know how to handle a boxer, and they did not know how to take a punch. They were mama's boys that wanted to wear a black belt. So I mowed through these guys like frickin' cheese, and it would piss the instructor off because it was embarrassing. A white belt beating up a black belt, right? Well, what did I know? I knew the fundamentals of combat. For me, it wasn't a bunch of boys hanging around tippy-tapping each other for points. I'm like, fuck, girls do that shit. Let's rock and roll here. I finally left Taekwondo and just stuck to boxing and got into kickboxing because it's a bunch of girlies fooling around. But the point I'm making is, I'm making the simple point. I knew the fundamentals of fighting, which you learn quickly in boxing because it's no holds barred. It hurts, right? It's the toughest 9 minutes in amateur sports. And people that study the fancy stuff before they master the basics have the danger of believing that they actually know what they're doing and end up usually causing big problems for themselves and the world. Right?
And so would you say, so whether it's business, whether you're a trainer, whether you're offering nutrition, what you're saying, and seems to be the philosophy you've had, is really understand the fundamentals or those key things that are going to make the big difference in whatever you're doing, the 80-20 principle, I guess.
Yes, and the other thing is, don't choose your mentors based on the academic degrees they have. Choose them on one thing and one thing only. Are they tangibly very good at what it is that you want to learn? When I became a therapist, I studied the world to find out who were the best people at infant development, who were the best people at centralizing discs or dealing with spinal pathology, who were the best shoulder experts, the best knee experts, and I went and paid money to be in their classes or to hire them to coach me personally. And after about 15 years, I got famous enough that when I would call them, they go, "Oh, Paul Chek, I've heard of you, I've read your articles, I'll trade with you." So then I got to the point where I would do a day or two with them, and then they'd do a day or two with me. But many of the greatest people out there will flat out admit they don't even use jack shit that they learned in school because it's so far outdated and most of it doesn't work. Now, just to clear, I'm not against academic education. I'm just against the abuse of academia and the brainwashing, because there are many geniuses with degrees that learn great stuff, and there's a wide difference in the quality of our education from one school to the other. I'm just talking about the hero's journey. And what I'm saying is the first thing you got to do is figure out who you are and what you stand for, or you're not a warrior. Because if you're standing for something you don't believe in as a warrior, you're as good as dead already, because you don't have enough heart to make it through the tough challenges that every real battle brings to you. Once you figure out who you are and what your dream is, my dream was to support athletes and human beings to live a healthier, happier life, because I could see it was obvious that they were missing the basics. They were eating junk food, they weren't sleeping properly, they didn't know jack shit about exercise, they didn't know how to rest properly. They were lost, and they were believing in science and sick scientists. There's an old saying, dead doctors don't lie. The average doctor dies 10 years earlier than their average patient, which isn't good marketing. So once you understand, okay, this is what turns my heart on, then you seek a mentor, then you meet the challenges of your growth and development, then you come up with your own ideas, and you meet the hellfire of the resistance of the program minds, which is why that poster is sitting right in my office. Albert Einstein said, "Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds," and he reminds me every day that I have had to put up with a lot of that kind of bullshit. And my wife keeps telling me, you think of it as a compliment because you can't make changes in the world or advance anything without getting attacked. And if you're getting attacked, you're either doing something great or you're scaring the shit out of people, meaning you're a crazy man.
Or a bit of both.
Yeah, well, they often go together, unfortunately. But
if you go into the industry in a traditional way, work at a health club, as an example, then what people get paid is less than what you could go if you're a waiter at a restaurant, for example. But people
yes and no, but that's part of growing up, you see, because the gym represents the family. It represents mommy and daddy, a roof over your head, someone else doing the marketing, someone else bringing people in, someone taking a cut of your pay.
Okay.
So really you're just the same as working for dad on the farm, being a soldier in the military and having no control over your own body because you're government property. You're being moved around as a pawn.
Okay.
So, but that's look, you got to work on a farm long enough to learn how to farm, because if you own a farm before you know how to farm, you will be a disaster to yourself and lose a lot of money, and
Right.
usually end up running to mommy and daddy, bail me out, or you go bankrupt, right? So part of being a warrior is doing the work to get the knowledge, the skill, and the confidence in yourself, and have enough experience to identify what is my unique identity.
Right.
What is it that I can offer that's uniquely different, that's worth more than the gym's going to pay me? Or the gym might pay me, but I'll have to sacrifice such a large percentage of it to them, it would be cheaper just to go take the risk of owning my own place and go for it.
Right.
Then you take that unique offering, and the first thing you got to do is start at the ground level, because you got to test it first, and a good place to test it is in a gym where you don't have the worry about marketing and overhead. You can really focus on refining your unique identity. Then when you have enough success and enough positive reinforcement from the environment, the people you're working with, then you say, okay, now it's time for me to get out of here, because I don't want to A, spend that much money to be here, and B, I have enough of a following to support my own my own endeavor. But then you're still working at a fairly ground level. So for example, it took me about 15 years of hard work to get to the point where I legitimately felt that I had education that I could offer people in tradable formats, be it books, DVDs, audios, which later then became online courses. So now for me to sit, I need to make about $750 an hour, or I'm losing money with the size of the organization that I run. And people come from all over the world and gladly pay me $750 an hour. But that's still not a great way for me to make money. And the only reason I do it is because I'm still growing my skills as a therapist. And I don't want to give up before I really reach that point of saying, okay, now I've reached a sense of satiation, and it's better for me to use those talents full time to support other people than it is to try to grow myself in one-on-one relationships. So it's probably about 50% of my work is business on a bigger scale, products, educational programs, big scale stuff. 50%'s me still learning and growing with people. And it's my philosophy, you should not be a teacher if you're not practicing, because you become a talking head in no time at the pace technology changes and the rate we grow. But the point I'm making is, once you reach enough mastery where you realize to grow further, you have to have consumables. Then you have to synthesize your clinical experience or your working experience in a gym or in a sports field or whatever it is, and make it something that is palatable to people that need to learn the basics first. And you package the basics. Right? I've been hired by many professional sports teams to help them figure out why athletes were getting broken all the time, or were broken and couldn't get fixed. And every single time they were overlooking the basics.
So just to sort of go back on that point to kind of clear the question then. So what you're saying, in some cases you're going to have to go and do a shitty job really to in that child stage, just to get that experience. And that's the price that you pay to get that in some cases.
And it shouldn't be a shitty job. I understand what you're saying, but that's a big mistake.
Maybe I've overemphasized the word shitty, but something you probably wouldn't be.
I've done shitty jobs, okay, but like, for example, working in the bilges of boats, sitting in fish guts and stink all day is a shitty job. But I had a family to feed. And of the shitty jobs available, it paid me the most, and it allowed me to use a skill set that I enjoyed using every day as a mechanic. And I had a good, solid understanding of mechanics, and I did good work for people, and they really appreciated my work. So once I got to the point where I realized that I could only go so far in the bilge of a boat working for somebody else, I had to figure out a way to go to the next level. But as I said, if I was working as a waiter or a waitress, even though it might have paid me the same money metaphorically, it would have been a shitty job for me because it wasn't who I am. So when I say be careful with the shitty job concept, you've got to consciously choose what you're going to do to make money that suits your personality. If being out in nature is who you are, then don't take a job in a building somewhere, or it will be a shitty job and your motivation will go down you won't do well. And if you're not inspired to do well, you won't be inspired to learn, and you won't learn how to learn, and you won't learn to have the confidence and the inspiration to tackle problems and add something to the world. You will just be on the hind tit mama's boy trying to get by like people living off of credit cards or taking workman's compensation and faking that they're injured and all sorts of horse shit that goes on rampantly around the world and makes it expensive for the taxpayers that really do pay their taxes. So
some of it's doing a job that you're probably not going to get paid as much as what you would like to, but you're learning it, not necessarily shitty. It's got to be something that's in line with what you would enjoy doing.
It's the best job you can get that moves you in the direction that gives you a sense of, this is what I'd rather do more than any of the options that I have.
Okay, yeah.
So,
and in some cases, I guess that could be that's just the best thing that you can get at that time for that money, and like doing the stuff in the shit that you were doing.
Yeah, and you have to have a sense of listening to your inner self. There are situations where you can get more money, but something inside you says, no, don't go that way. For example, when I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, I had an interesting experience one day. I was standing in the shower after just finishing my mile in the swimming pool. There was nobody around, and I felt this weird sensation. Somebody was watching me. I turned around, and there was a captain in full dress uniform standing in the shower looking at me, and I said, what do you need? And he said, you're Paul Chek, aren't you? I said, yes. Well, he began to rattle off all sorts of information about me that I was really surprised. He knew I was a motocross racer. He knew I was a stock car racer, a drag racer. He knew I had training in mechanics. He knew a lot of stuff about me. And he said, I am from Delta Force, and you fit our criteria. Would you be willing to try out for Delta Force? Well, I happen to have a friend in Delta Force who was one of my buddies that I did triathlon training with. And I'd learned enough from him. He couldn't tell me much because it's highly secret, but I learned enough from him that many of these missions are one-way missions. You may never come home. And I said, as much as I would love to take the challenge, I got a little boy and a wife. And I'm more interested in coming home than proving how badass I am. So thank you for the offer. Okay, so my point is, I could have got a pay raise.
Yeah.
I could have been in a prestigious position, considered to be one of the most badass soldiers on the world, but it would have been moving in a direction that my heart didn't feel good with. Okay.
Yeah. And that comes back to the question in terms of the passion and the financial side. So I think what you're saying is, if you structure the business right as a trainer and you learn the basics, you can go on to, you've obviously got to be a practitioner, but you could go on and sell those fundamentals in a way where you can generate income, not just by the hour, but I guess in terms, I think you've answered my question, whereas yes, the money and what you do are both equally important, and you should be able to make the money, but sometimes there could be opportunities where you could make a little bit more money, but it's not in the direction that you're going, and it's important to know the difference. Is that?
Yes, that's exactly right, but there's another caveat to that. Sometimes it's worth sacrificing money because you're around a master.
Right.
So, for example, when I was a young man, for extra money, I worked for a man named Len Roller, who built NASCAR racing engines, and his two boys were nationally ranked motocross racers and were my great inspiration. I was a very good motocross racer. I was ranked 5th in British Columbia. I think I got 5th in the Canadian Championships one year. But I was a ranked motocross racer. So the three of us were traveling together. His dad took care of us on the road, and Len Roller was the best mechanic I've ever met in my friggin' life, and I've met a lot of mechanics, and I can build cars. I've worked for Napa Auto Parts rebuilding engines. Like I told you, I went to trade school. This guy knew shit that blew my mind. Okay, when I was a kid, every spare minute I got, I had to ride my bicycle 8 miles to town, and I would work for that guy, cleaning floors, taking spark plugs out of engines, doing anything I could do just to watch and listen. There's been times when I have got no pay, but to be around a great therapist or a skilled physician and watch what they were doing and listen to how they engaged people was worth more than money could buy.
Right.
So the big problem is we as a culture are so up in our heads that we forget to feel what's happening inside of us. Consciousness, according to Jung's consciousness compass, has 4 key qualities. Thinking, which is counterbalanced by feeling. Sensation, which is counterbalanced by intuition. So sensation is the 5 senses and all the information gathered by your physical systems or your nervous system. Thinking is the intellectual process, which is a search for meaning. So you have sensation, it tells you what's real. This cup is hot, or this water's cold, the table's hard. Thinking, processing cognitive ideas, concepts. Feeling, values, and the biochemistry of your body, which if your body's unhealthy, it produces emotions that reflect unhealthiness. If it's healthy, it produces emotions that reflect vitality. But most of our feeling states produce emotions because we have values. So for example, if you're standing in line for 10 minutes at the grocery store and someone just cuts in front of you when it's your turn, you're going to get pissed off because they've trespassed a value which triggers an emotional charge. Intuition is being able to see beyond the parts to get something that is the whole or greater than the whole, which requires that you shut the mind off, because the mind's like a garbage disposal. It chops everything up into bite-sized pieces, and intuition delivers full-on packages. A whole book can come in an insight. And if you don't have the capacity to calm your mind and relax your mind and be brave enough to wait for the answer from the universe and trust there's something bigger than you that's behind the whole thing, then you run around dealing with these bite-sized chunks of information and you become an intellectual. And Carl Jung says intellectualism is a common cover-up for fear of direct experience, and it's damn true. You can usually put it, the formula this way: the more references a person has in their article, the less they know, because they need someone else's approval, right? So what I'm saying is, if you really want to find your way, you have to pay attention to what you feel. Hot, cold, soft, wet, dry, the right mix of cement, the wrong mix of cement, the right texture of wool, the wrong texture of wool, ... Sensation. You got to work with ideas, but always find meaning. If you can't find meaning, either you're confused, you're in the wrong spot, or you don't have enough brain power to do the job, or you haven't been taught well. Feeling, what are the values that are important to me? How is it? What is happy making for me? What are the quality of foods I need? How much money do I need to make to live my dream right now? How much exercise do I need to be the person I'm proposing to be? How much rest do I need to keep myself vital and my brain working? So those are just core values. And then you got to keep your body healthy enough that you're not trapped in the downplay of biochemistry, because as soon as your biochemistry is off because you're not healthy, every cell in your body sends an alert to your brain, which triggers an alarm reflex, and now you go into a survival mode, which activates the left brain, elevates cortisol levels. And as I say to my students, it's never a good idea to throw in a cartwheel when you're running from a lion, which means whenever you're not physiologically healthy, your body's in a state of stress and it blocks you from trying new ideas.
Right.
Your brain stops working and it wants to be totally self-centered as a survival strategy. So we've got to get still enough to work with intuition, which is the most powerful of all of them, in my opinion. Most of what I learned came by way of intuition. But the problem is, to work intuition effectively, you have to have enough knowledge with whatever it is that you're intuiting to have a receptive field. For example, if I'm doing an intuitive healing on you, but I have no training in anatomy, I might get an insight that you've got toxins trapped in your liver, but if I don't know what the hell a liver is, then I don't really know what I've just been given. Yeah. So we have to have enough working knowledge and understand the principles and practices and the laws, if you will, of the field we're in to have an effective receptive field, so that when intuition comes, we have enough mental capacity to make meaning out of the insight and feel what it is, and then use our sensory systems to test it and say, does it really work? But most people are so freaking hungry for recognition and to be acknowledged that they will beg, borrow, and steal from people and not know anything they're doing. I mean, plagiarization is one of the biggest things I've suffered my whole career, to the point that it was very financially stressful. I mean, at one point, I think Penny and I were spending $35,000 to $50,000 a year on cease and desist letters from our lawyer, because so many books, audios, videos, and all sorts of stuff, just ripping my stuff right off, taking everything I developed without even mentioning my name. So that's one of the prices.
But what you're saying is really without, like, it'll get you so far, but without having that whole integrated thing together,
you're crippled.
You're wasted.
The mind, consciousness works on those four principles: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. And our culture is very, very heavy into the thinking, but shuts down the feeling state. And we're also overly sensory driven. We're so aesthetically driven and so driven by surface appearances that we're caught in the trap of sensory pleasures without realizing that thinking and sensing are masculine outward principles. The cup's outside of you, the table's outside of you, the ideas running from your head largely came from outside of you. Values and emotions are internal or feminine, and intuition is feminine. And we're such a yang-dominated, masculized, male, crazy culture. Go, 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 do, ass kicker, fake it till you fucking make it, all this kind of silly shit that we've completely annihilated our connection to the feminine. I mean, in our culture, to hug and kiss another man is very unacceptable unless you've just beaten the shit out of the guy in a boxing ring. Then everyone thinks it's great. So a man can love a man in our culture if he tortures the shit out of him first. Now, there's just an example of how twisted our culture has become, because the same principles that we have to use to stuff our feminine energy down are the principles that stuff our connection to our feelings and our intuition down.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons I retired from fighting at 24 years of age, because I realized most of the fighters, I would say, I came to a conclusion that almost every single fighter that I met, with rare exception, was still right pissed off at their father, and they were really trying to deal with the stress and build the strength, the courage, and the power to defend themselves against their father one day. So I actually had all 30 fighters on the team one day, and I asked, how many of you got into boxing largely because you wanted to beat the shit out of your father because of the way he treated you and your mother? Guess how many hands went up out of 30?
Yeah, I would say a good 60 or 70%.
28. 28 of the hands on the third best boxing team in the world went up to say, I'm here ultimately because my father was so fucking invasive and scary, I had to arm myself against him. There's excessive masculine energy right in the household, and it creates distorted mental development that leads men to being unconscious warriors, badasses that aren't intelligent, that push through everything and don't feel, don't listen to their heart, and it often makes them the badass that the girls want, but they become hard, cold men that don't listen and tell you it's my way or the fucking highway, and it leads to lots of broken relationships, and it leads to kids being treated like soldiers and pawns, and it fucks our whole culture up. And I'm simply saying, if you want to grow yourself in any field, then your work is to find teachers that can show you how to use those four functions of consciousness, because if any one of them is crippled, it's just like this. If you have a wheel with four spokes, and as I say to my students, one called Dr. Happiness, one called Dr. Movement, one called Dr. Quiet, one called Dr. Diet, well, you've also got thinking, feeling, and sensation and intuition connected to those spokes. If one of those spokes breaks, will that wheel roll? It will collapse into something that looks more like a triangle.
Okay.
The amount of energy you have to generate to make that wheel roll in life is enough to burn you out quite quickly. If two of them is disabled, you have a half circle.
Right.
Try rolling that.
Right.
Okay? The point I'm making is the cost of us not being taught as children how to use thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition in a conscious, effective way, and learning how to connect to those qualities is devastating, because we actually can be like scientists who are dead sure what they're doing is good, but produce drugs and end up killing people, microwave ovens that ruin food, and all the while they're completely denying that the technology is bad, and ultimately fill the world full of stuff that doesn't work at all, and we aren't saving any time. We're destroying the entire planet by being so smart that we're stupid.
Right.
So I say an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less until they know absolutely everything about nothing.
So just because I'm getting flash on time, so where we have covered a lot of ground very on the surface, and there's probably so much more we could spend on each part. If people want to, understand this a lot more, where would they go to find out more about, I guess, some of the things we've touched on today and some of the other things about what you're working on at the moment?
Well, my Chek Holistic Lifestyle Coaching Program, which you can do level 1 right online.
Right.
When you go into level 2, which is how to coach people professionally as a holistic lifestyle coach, it gets you into the foundation principles of everything from eating to exercising and breathing to sleeping to movement. I teach you how to differentiate working out from working in, cultivating life force energy relative to spending it. I teach you the principles of how the mind works, how the emotions work. I give technologies for dealing with your own emotional entanglements, turmoils. I show you how to coach people in their own challenges, how to help people with relationship problems. So it's a very comprehensive 5-day training program that gives you a complete system of analysis and shows you how to engage in effective coaching. My Chek 4-quadrant coaching mastery system is very comprehensive, and it's a full system for analyzing the psychophysical relationships, identifying where your belief systems are holding you back, what the shadow is, how to work with it, what are the key archetypes you have to understand, how do you identify what your working archetype is that's going to fulfill your dreams so you can work with it, how to manage your time so that you're moving your archetypal energy into the world in an effective, efficient way. What are the things that cause problems in relationships? What is an addiction? What do you do when you have an addiction? How do you coach somebody with an addiction? How does consciousness grow and develop? What are different meditation techniques you can use to get to the next stage? How does the principles of alchemy work in life? I developed an entire system called Chek Life Process Alchemy to show you how we move through these different stages we've just been talking about, how to deal with resistance at each stage, and how to understand the basic principles that drive life so you can basically diagnose why people are having problems and get to the root of the cause and problem instead of just dealing with symptoms. Chek Exercise Coach is the beginning of the Chek Practitioner program, which goes from exercise coach to level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Each takes on different regions of the body and shows you how to integrate that with your previous training. It gives you the basics of corrective exercise and the science of what you need to know to do a proper assessment to determine how to use exercise scientifically. And then it teaches you the principles of high performance conditioning for athletes as well. So you master corrective exercise first, so you know how to use exercise scientifically. So when you're applying high performance exercise, you're using it intelligently instead of destroying people. For example, Look at all the people running the kettlebell classes, CrossFit, and all these ass kicker classes, but they haven't even met the basics of balancing their body. So all they do is basically run right towards an orthopedic surgeon's office and make somebody else a lot of money, and they don't even get to choose the color of the car they end up buying.
And are they all workshops you're doing in the US, or is it?
Well, they're all over the world, and
right.
A fair bit of the training now can be done online. The prerequisite courses can be done online. I have my PPS Success Mastery Program, which is ppssuccess.com. So what I did is I identified the 12 most common roadblocks that I saw in my patients and students and clients over the years that limited their ability to live their dream fully. Right. And I made a lesson specifically on how to address each of those 12. For example, lesson 12 is sacred listening. So I did a lesson on the skill set that's necessary for effectively listening when you're working with people that have challenges or when you're working with yourself or in relationships. I've got lessons on there on the great polarities, how the universe really works. I've got lessons on how to learn. I've got PPS lesson 1, how to find and live your legacy, which is your life dream. So it takes you through the process, the things you need to know to get clear on what your dream is, how you will recognize it when you see it. Lesson 2 is self-management, which is the science of brainwashing, how it's being used against you, but how you can use it to heal yourself instead of succumbing to it. Right. Use the same science to heal yourself. Lesson 3 is goal setting. So without going through all the lessons, They're the key roadblocks that stop us from living a full life and taking responsibility for the choices that we make.
Right.
And it's what I've had to use with thousands and thousands of clients to help them get healthy and stop re-injuring themselves or getting divorced over and over or losing jobs over and over or whatever it was.
And where would people find out about you? I know you've got a lot of stuff on YouTube. You've got a YouTube channel.
Yeah, YouTube is youtube.com/Paul Chek Live, all stuck together. I got over 500 videos. That's my social. That's my gift to society, is those free videos, and there's over 500 of them.
Right.
PaulCheksBlog.com is where the written blog is, and the video blogs are embedded there too. A lot of people go right to YouTube. C.H.E.K Institute.com, you can see all the training programs, and we have Chek Europe that handles the European regions. We have Chek Australia for the South Pacific, but you can access them all through that portal.
Right, okay.
And there, you've got, I've written well over 400 articles. I've produced over 100 videos and DVDs. I've written 11 books. I've done many different audios on different things, audio books, audio meditations, 4 doctor audios that go beyond the 4 doctors ebook. I got ebooks.
So there's plenty of ways people can courses. Come and find out about you.
Yeah, like I said, it takes 7 years for Chek professionals to really do the work, and they can be studying full time. And my work is a synthesis of the best minds that I could find in any different profession or any vein of thought. And I synthesize it, and then I work with it in my own life or my clinical life or my professional life. And then I add and integrate and refine, so the parts that I add are often unique, but they're often... shall we say, it's like learning the basics of cooking and then coming up with a new way to make sticky buns or something. Or, like I told you, I developed the whole concept of putting butter and espresso and nut oils in coffee to help people manage blood sugar better. And in fact, I was listening to an interview with a cardiologist on Sounds True's Insights at the Edge, and he was talking about it, had no idea where it came from, and said, well, I think it's a really bad idea because it clogs the arteries. Well, first of all, that's based on the concept that fat clogs arteries, but healthy fat doesn't do that, or the Eskimos would have gone out of existence way before now, and there's many other cultures that would have too. But what he didn't realize, it was for managing blood sugar. And so all I'm sharing is that my own process, by using the 4 functions of consciousness, when you pay attention to what's in your environment, sensation, when you use thinking to try to find legitimate meaning, when you have healthy core values to direct your pursuit, and you are wise enough to sit still and be with yourself and get quiet and open the door to intuition, magic starts to happen.
Right, yeah.
And, one of the things that's kept me going is there's been so much magic in my creative life, and that's one of the reasons I do a lot of art, is to keep my mind out of trying to solve problems and being open and receptive to images and impressions from out of nowhere.
Right.
And learning, rock stacking. I do a lot of rock work out there in nature, and I just talk to the rocks. It sounds funny, but until you get still enough, you won't hear the voice of nature. You'll only hear the chatterbox between your ears. But I've been blessed to be able to go on these adventures and come up with wild things. I showed you all my patents a minute ago. Anybody that's followed me knows I've pioneered lots of things. Introducing Swiss balls to the gym industry, many, many other things. The list is long, but when you get led to those things by something inside you that's greater than you, it keeps you inspired, it keeps you alive, it keeps you motivated, and it gives you the strength to work through the challenges that are natural in all lives, because without those challenges, we would have no impetus to grow or to learn or to become.
No.
I say to people all the time, if you had a choice, I was going to wave a magic wand and get rid of all the things you learned when you were having fun, happy, and free of stress, versus all the things you learned when you were dealing with challenges, which would you want me to get rid of? Nobody has ever told me, wipe out the joy. No one's ever said they would want me to wipe out the joy. They would all want to keep the challenges.
Yeah.
They realized that the times they were having fun weren't the times they were learning and growing the most.
No. That's right.
So I'm saying the challenges are necessary to grow and engage, but our culture drugs them and tries to run from the challenges and wants to be on the hind titty of instant gratification all the time, but you don't grow that way.
No.
So my system gives you the skill set to find what it is that you love enough to engage in a labor of love, learn, grow, and become something that gives you a sense of satiation that when you go to bed at night, you're excited to wake up tomorrow because you know there may be more magic arriving in the intuitive mailbox or through experience, or the joy of someone who was in pain for 20 years all of a sudden being able to play with their kids, or an athlete who is medically retired who's now back doing amazing things. All of these are things that I've got to celebrate and enjoy.
So
Paul, keep me going.
Final question then. So Escape Your Limits is about people who have escaped what I guess society and other people say can't be done. What would be one of your most memorable examples of where I guess you've escaped your limits in terms of what people say can't be done, but you have done it?
Well, I would say that my whole institute is a collection of escapes, of limitations. I got a 9th grade education. I've lectured in medical schools, chiropractic schools, physiotherapy schools, physical therapy schools, massage schools, strength and conditioning conferences, personal training conferences. I'm one of the few guys in the world that's crossed all those boundaries and reached a level of respect in multiple professions for unique, cutting-edge, practical ideas and concepts that any one of those professions could use and does use to this very day. And all of those came by me going outside of the norm and crossing the boundaries and being brave enough to be different and having the strength to keep pulling the arrows out of my back from all the naysayers and the people giving negative commentary. But I always tell my students, don't believe a word I say. Go practice it. If it doesn't work, then come back and we'll talk. And every student that's ever come back was doing it wrong when I taught them how to do it. It did work. And I remind them, I've done this 1,000 times before I've taught it to you once. But I tell people all the time, don't believe a word I say. Be skeptical, but pay attention so that when you test it, you're being honest with yourself and with me.
Right.
And so that's, for me, it's been a great adventure, and it still is, because as I grow deeper and deeper into myself, I find yet more and more ways to help people and more dogmas to explode and more rigid structures that need to be melted down and reformed for our own health, vitality, and humanity.
Yeah, Paul. Well, that's a great place to end. We could definitely stand here all afternoon. But thank you very much for your time. It's been very very cool.
Thanks for your interest, and it's good to know we share the same barber.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul.
Grass doesn't grow on a busy street, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.